Welcome to Assessment Through a UDL Lens. We know that assessments are a vital part of any classroom, of any learning experience. So the UDL guidelines can help us be mindful and empathetic designers from the get-go. When we think about the purpose of assessment, really it's about gathering data, gathering information in regards to the current state of learning in order for both you and your students to make decisions about next steps. These checks for understanding are important throughout the entirety of the learning process, before, during, and after, as we work to help support and scaffold our students as they build skills and deepen their understanding of concepts. When we think about assessments, the UDL guidelines can really, truly help us be mindful and empathetic designers so that we ensure that we are actually gaining true insight into our students' understanding so that we can guide our instructional practice while simultaneously helping our students to move towards becoming expert learners who are in the driver's seat of their own learning journey. When we turn to the UDL guidelines to help us with our crafting of assessments, we actually have to look at the beginning with engagement. Now, there's a lot of connections between this idea, the foundations behind assessment, and the UDL guidelines. But the part I really want to focus in on the engagement piece, that inviting students into the learning process from the get-go. Part of it falls on us as instructors to be very, very mindful of what our goals and what our purposes are for the learning outcomes for our students. But when we know those, that can actually be an opportunity to invite our students into the learning process. So I really focus in on not only the recruiting interest, but especially focusing in on the sustaining effort and persistence. When we help our students know what their end goals are, it can actually be a way to invite students in because they know where they're going from the very, very beginning of the learning process. I also think about this idea of when it comes to self-regulation, this idea of developing self-assessment and reflection. That can be a really big part of this whole assessment piece. I mean, it says self-assessment, so it's that ability to reflect. And I also think about, and I'm going to go back to the sustaining effort and persistence piece, the idea of increasing mastery-oriented feedback. Feedback and assessment go hand in hand in order to move students forward in their learning journey. So starting from the very beginning of the UDL guidelines, we're seeing a lot of pieces to help us think about that clarity and inviting students into the learning process. When I then transferred to the representation column, there's a couple things to be mindful of when designing my assessments. So if I know what it is I want my students to know or be able to do as part of that assessment journey, then I go into that representation column and I really look at the perception piece. And I think about starting to design my assessments with my students in mind so that I'm offering alternatives to auditory information. So making sure that there's multiple modalities in which the students can engage with the content of the assessment itself. Same thing, offering alternatives to visual information. So making sure that those pieces are supportive so that students can get to the part where they get to show their mastery. I also think about the second component of language and symbols. Sometimes I think about my own practice as an English teacher, that sometimes there's that need to clarify vocabulary, or even I think about math teachers, clarify symbols. And so we're going to talk about that in just a little bit more detail in just a minute, but really making sure that the assessment itself is not creating a barrier for students to be able to then figure out what it is that you're even asking them to do. So supporting that decoding of text and mathematical notations and symbols, and illustrating through multiple media. So sometimes putting that personal spin on things. And then finally, when I think about action and expression, this is kind of that demonstrating knowledge at the end of the learning process. So originally, when I first encountered the UDL guidelines, this was where my mind went first. But you'll notice that, as we just talked about, there's some foundational pieces that are going to help us be successful at the end. However, when we think about this action and expression, this is how our students are showing us what they really, truly know. And when we think about the expression and commitment, communication column, Thinking about using multiple media for communication of ideas and using multiple tools for construction and composition. So we're going to dive into a little bit deeper what those actually mean, but thinking about having multiple pathways, multiple ways for students to really show what they know. And then the last piece, oftentimes we don't think about the executive functioning skills and assessments because sometimes, and I'll be honest, this is my own perception. When I think about executive functioning, I think about organization, but it's more than that. It's about goal setting. It's about your ability to manage yourself and monitor your own progress. And so thinking about how we can leverage assessments for these pieces. So with that in mind, here's a few considerations when you're designing your own assessments in your classroom through a UDL lens. So the first thing that the UDL guidelines teach us that's super important about designing assessment is to know your goals, to know exactly what it is that you want your students to know or be able to do as a result of the learning that they're going to experience with you. Now, Katie Novak, who is one of the experts in UDL, she often talks about standards, which obviously standards are guiding our practice. But she talks about knowing the different types of standards, whether it's a skill standard or a concept standard. Now, this is really, really important because knowing what kind of goal you are trying to achieve by addressing that standard will help you design the type of assessment needed. So if it's a skill assessment, students are going to have to be demonstrating something, their mastery of something. If it's a concepts standard, then they're going to have to show their mastery and their understanding of an idea. And that can be important when we think about the type of assessment that we're crafting. We also need to be very mindful about the purpose of the assessments. Now, we think about the idea of using assessment throughout the entirety of the learning process. So we also need to be mindful of when and how we're using the assessments and the results of those assessments. There's also this idea of assessment of learning. So are we wanting to show like mastery? Assessment for learning. Are we wanting our students to reflect on where they are in their journey? Or assessment as learning, a moment of being able to reflect and deepen their own understanding of who they are as a learner in order to continue to move forward. This is extremely, extremely important to be very clear as a teacher with this whole idea of knowing your goals, because once again, it's going to help you craft assessments that are really, truly honing in on what you want your students to know and be able to do. So the second thing I would encourage you to consider is actively working to remove barriers so that the assessment itself is not causing you to lose insight on what your students do or do not understand. So when we talk about actively working to remove barriers, we're thinking about, first and foremost, modalities. We're thinking about the ways in which we're asking students to represent their learning and their understanding. Now, this does get into the action and expression piece a little bit too, but we want to make sure that the modality of the assessment itself is not causing a barrier. For example, if it's a paper pencil piece, is there something that we can do to scaffold those students who might need reading support, for example? We also need to be mindful of the vocabulary that we're using. Oftentimes, I realized as a former language arts teacher, I was using language on the assessments that my students weren't familiar with, and therefore they couldn't demonstrate the concepts. For example, if I was asking them to analyze something, it requires that the students know what that word analyze means. So we need to be very, very mindful of the language that we're using on the assessments so that that's not prohibiting our students from demonstrating their true understanding. Same thing, I think, mathematically, that symbolic representation. I know I was working with a math teacher a few years ago who, because of the way that things were working on the assessment itself, the students were seeing multiplication in a new representation on the assessment. And so that symbolic representation, a dot versus an X, just some of those kinds of things that might throw your students for a loop. And thinking about the way in which you're asking them to demonstrate. So more on that in just a second. As we then think about the action and expression piece, making sure that there are multiple pathways for our students to demonstrate. And so this is where that clarity about the goals really, really becomes extremely important. If, for example, we are an ELA teacher and we are wanting our students to demonstrate their ability to craft or create a written response, well, then asking them to do a written response is important. That form or the modality goes along with that particular skill. However, if we are wanting our students to demonstrate their understanding of a concept, like, for example, character analysis, we need to be aware that sometimes the modality in which we ask our students to represent their understanding could prohibit us from understanding what they truly do or do not know. So what do I mean by that? Well, as a former ELA teacher, I loved the written word. Makes sense. But if the only mode that I ever asked my students to represent their learning in was that paper pencil piece, then I was losing out sometimes on what my students truly knew when I had a student who struggled to get their thoughts on paper. Maybe there was a physical piece, maybe there was that just the processing piece. So instead, thinking about how I could invite students into the learning process by allowing them to do a visual representation, or allowing my students to record themselves either with a video or audio explaining something. Those types of things allowed me a little bit more flexibility in gaining insights, because my purpose was to understand their thinking, not for them to demonstrate a skill. So this is that difference between the skill and the concept. Okay. We also want to be very, very aware of kind of how sometimes providing lots of modalities of action and expression could actually prohibit our students as well. It might make them a little bit overwhelmed. So just being mindful of how we're asking our students to share their learning and how the ask could actually be a barrier itself. So the final thing that I would really encourage you to think about is how you can invite your students back into the assessment process. Oftentimes, assessment feels like something that's done to students, not with students. So really harnessing this idea of being able to use assessment for and as learning, to provide students the space and the opportunity to fully embrace that power of yet, to really own their learning process by goal setting and monitoring their own progress. So there's a lot of really amazing ideas of how you can go about this. If, for example, you have been working on a rubric that goes along with assessment, showing the students the rubric at the beginning is a great way to invite them in so that they know what that end goal is. And as they're working on their project, to constantly revisit where they are in terms of demonstrating a concept or a skill. Same thing with learning progressions. Learning progressions allow students that ability to reflect on where they are with a skill, not necessarily in the development of a project, with their own understanding of their thinking, but also asking students to reflect on what they learned as a result of the learning process, not just in terms of a skill or concept, but also what they learned about themselves, what worked or what did not work for themselves. So when we think about the UDL guidelines, it really does help us think about assessment in a slightly different way and to be very, very intentional and empathetic designers of our assessment.